Some mornings begin quietly with nothing more than the soft shuffle of everyday life: children heading to school, elders sitting outside their homes, workers moving through familiar streets. Yet beneath that calm, history can be shifting in ways that ordinary people only feel long before they fully understand. That is the image I want you to imagine today: a continent going about its day, while something far larger takes shape behind the scenes, something that could alter the path of millions. Just days ago, the world's most powerful nations gathered on African soil for the G20 and the B20. For many, it was just another summit, another polished stage with leaders taking photos under bright lights. But for those paying close attention, especially the older generations who have lived through broken promises, abandoned reforms, and decades of unequal partnerships, this moment felt different. It felt heavier, more complicated, and perhaps more hopeful. For the first time, Africa was not simply the backdrop. It was the setting, the host, the center of gravity. And people across the continent found themselves asking a simple but profound question: what does this really mean for us? Is this the beginning of a genuine turning point where African nations finally negotiate with the world as partners instead of supplicants? Or is it yet another moment where bold words echo through conference halls but vanish when the cameras go dark? These questions matter not only to Africans, but to Americans watching from afar, especially those of you who understand how global decisions ripple across ordinary households. You know that diplomacy isn't abstract. It affects family budgets, fuel prices, markets, alliances, and the moral standing of nations. So before we go deeper, let me ask you, if the world is indeed shifting, whose voice will shape the new direction, and who will be left behind if we fail to pay attention? If this topic resonates with you, if you believe ordinary people should understand what really unfolded behind those closed doors, then stay with us. Please share this message with someone who still believes Africa's story matters. And subscribe if you believe truth should come before headlines. In cities across Africa, people woke up on the morning of the summit unaware that history was quietly crossing their borders. Street vendors laid out their goods as usual, bus drivers warmed their engines, and grandparents settled into their familiar morning routines. Yet above the ordinary rhythm of life, an extraordinary gathering was taking shape: leaders, security convoys, diplomatic entourages, each piece of the global puzzle moving into place on African soil. For the first time in history, the G20 was meeting on this continent, and not just anywhere, but in South Africa, a nation whose story has long been marked by struggle, sacrifice, and unyielding hope. Inside the conference venues, the air felt both ceremonial and tense. Delegates walked briskly between rooms, clutching files, exchanging formal greetings, and following a schedule crafted with military precision. But beneath the surface of routine diplomacy, something deeper was unfolding. For decades, Africa had been treated as the stage on which others performed. This time, the continent was not merely hosting, it was asserting. It was stepping into the center of the world's most influential economic conversation. From the very beginning, observers sensed that this G20 would not follow predictable patterns. The question on everyone's lips, whether whispered in corridors or spoken aloud in interviews, was simple: what does the world truly expect from Africa now that global power dynamics are shifting? That question gained weight when unexpected drama surfaced around one particular country, the United States of America. In the weeks leading to the summit, discussions about the level of U.S. participation began quietly, but grew louder as the event approached. Logistical details had been prepared. Security arrangements had been reviewed. Access rights had been programmed into systems that usually only move when political certainty is guaranteed. Nothing about this preparation was casual. For a country of America's stature, decisions are never made overnight. Reconnaissance teams assess airports, motorcade routes, security perimeters, and evacuation paths. Intelligence units coordinate across multiple agencies. Even minor delegates undergo screening. All of this had already been set in motion. That is why when the United States abruptly altered its participation at a late stage, the shift was not interpreted as a scheduling conflict. It was seen as a deliberate political choice. Money had already been spent. Clearances had already been issued. To withdraw after such preparation required a high-level decision, one that signaled something deeper than concerns over logistics. Access codes had to be revoked, security portals shut down, diplomatic pathways closed. In the world of statecraft, this kind of reversal speaks louder than any press statement. For South Africans, this absence carried emotional weight. Many citizens held their breath, hoping the summit would symbolize stability, cooperation, and renewed global faith in Africa's leadership. Instead, the unexpected decision by the U.S. highlighted what analysts had quietly warned for months. The relationship between Washington and Pretoria was strained perhaps more severely than the public understood. When American spokespersons dismissed the South African president with inflammatory language calling his statements reckless or misguided, it was not merely a political disagreement. It cast a shadow of disrespect over the millions who elected him. Yet inside the summit hall, something remarkable took shape. The empty seat where the United States would have been became a powerful symbol. On one side of the table, the world's largest economy was missing. On the other side sat Africa, Asia, particularly Southeast Asia and Latin America. For decades known as the periphery, these regions suddenly found themselves at the center of the global conversation. Without the weight of Washington's presence dominating the agenda, other voices rose with clarity and confidence. Delegates from the Global South pressed for recognition not as beneficiaries of charity nor as passive observers, but as equal partners. They talked of minerals, of debt burdens, of fair economic rules. They spoke of centuries of extraction, structural disadvantage, and future potential. The absence of one major power created space for dozens of others to finally speak without interruption. As the first day of the summit drew to a close, one truth became clear: this was not an ordinary meeting. It marked the beginning of a new conversation about justice, sovereignty, and Africa's rightful place in shaping the world's future. The next steps, what would be demanded, declared, or challenged, would define the momentum of the days ahead. As the summit progressed, a quiet tension began to ripple through the host city, felt not only in the polished conference halls, but also in the streets outside. Taxi drivers discussing the news over their radios, shopkeepers listening to briefings from small TV screens, and elders gathered under shaded corners sensed that the atmosphere had shifted. Something bigger, more confrontational, was unfolding inside the walls of the G20. The polite choreography of global diplomacy was starting to fracture, revealing the true fault lines beneath. The first spark of the unfolding drama was the blunt absence of the United States, which had already unsettled delegates and observers. Yet the real shock came in how this absence changed the behavior of those who remained. For years, many nations of the Global South had spoken in cautious tones, never too loudly, never too boldly, always aware of the political weight large powers carried. But now, with the defining presence of Washington missing, their voices grew steadier, clearer, less hesitant. They were no longer navigating around a towering influence seated at the table. The room felt unusually open. It was in this environment that the true chaos gem Jiao took place. During internal discussions, murmurs circulated that key nations in the West, though present, were preparing to resist or dilute any collective declaration that shifted too much power toward developing countries. Some Western advisors subtly suggested that the summit might end without a unified final statement, a move that would weaken Africa's leverage and preserve the status quo of global economic arrangements. South Africa, as host, recognized the danger immediately. Delegates privately described the moment as one of the most delicate in the summit. A decision had to be made quickly and strategically to prevent the narrative from slipping out of Africa's hands. Then came the unexpected maneuver, the turning point that left many stunned. Before any negotiations could erode the language of the Global South, South Africa released the joint declaration at the very start of the summit. Not at the end, not after debates, but before potential pressure could reshape it. This move defied diplomatic tradition, and for a moment the hall fell into a stunned stillness. Western delegations had anticipated hours, possibly days, of bargaining. Instead, they found themselves facing a fait accompli, a document already published, already distributed, already anchored as the official voice of the Global South. Shock turned into whispered frustration among certain representatives. A few saw it as a breach of diplomatic etiquette. Others realized the symbolism immediately. Africa, often treated as a junior partner, had just executed a bold strategic play normally reserved for global heavyweights. Outside the venue, African journalists and analysts erupted with excitement. Many called it an act of political courage. Some labeled it a historic assertion of sovereignty. Citizens watching from afar felt, perhaps for the first time, that their leaders were no longer timid in the face of global power. But if the declaration marked the diplomatic high point, the second wave of the summit's climax came through the emotional force of the discussions themselves. Countries from Africa, Asia, and Latin America used this newly opened space to speak with a raw honesty that had rarely surfaced in such gatherings. They talked about minerals extracted for centuries with little benefit left behind. They described the crushing burden of debt, $921 billion paid in interest by developing nations in a single recent year. They detailed how credit rating agencies operating thousands of miles away imposed an Africa penalty that forced nations to borrow at 8.5 to 10%, while wealthier nations borrowed at 4% or less. These were not just technical grievances, they were expressions of generational pain. Delegates spoke of hospitals without medicine, roads that crumble faster than they can be repaired, children walking miles to school, and entire populations trapped under interest payments larger than national health budgets. Western representatives confronted with this unfiltered testimony had no choice but to listen. The emotional weight in the room was unmistakable. As the exchanges intensified, it became clear that the Global South was no longer simply asking for recognition. It was demanding structural change, not symbolic gestures, but re-engineered systems for minerals, debt, and investment. This was not the language of charity or assistance. It was the language of justice. In the final hours of the summit's climactic moment, a new and unfamiliar reality settled over the hall. Africa and the Global South had spoken not as petitioners, but as architects of their own future. And the world, whether ready or not, was forced to respond. As the summit's bold declarations echoed across the continent, the real weight of these discussions settled upon the shoulders of ordinary people, those who would never set foot inside a G20 hall, yet would live with the consequences of its decisions for generations. In the quiet corners of towns and villages, where parents measure the cost of meals, where students share worn textbooks, and where small clinics struggle with limited supplies, the promises made by world leaders suddenly felt both urgent and fragile. This was the space where lofty economic theories collided with everyday survival. The first major consequence centered on Africa's mineral wealth, the same resources that built industries on distant shores while leaving mining communities with little more than dust and empty promises. At the summit, leaders of the Global South declared with unusual unity that the minerals are ours, a phrase simple in sound but revolutionary in meaning. For decades, Africa captured only about 5% of the value generated from its own gold, cobalt, lithium, and rare earths resources that power smartphones, electric cars, and modern infrastructure around the world. If even a portion of the processing were to take place within African borders, the political effects would be vast. Factories would rise near mining towns. Job opportunities would expand for young people long pushed to the margins. Governments would gain revenue to fund roads, hospitals, and schools, and communities that had known only extraction would finally experience transformation. But this shift threatened powerful global interests, making the political stakes enormous. It was not simply about economics. It was about reclaiming the right to shape one's own destiny. The second consequence was tied to the crushing burden of foreign debt, an issue spoken about at the summit not as financial management, but as a matter of morality. Developing nations had paid approximately $921 billion in interest in a single recent year, not principal-only interest. For many African nations, these payments exceeded their health budgets. The human cost was severe understaffed hospitals, unreliable electricity in surgical wards, outdated medical equipment, and entire regions where mothers gave birth without trained professionals. In political terms, this created a form of quiet paralysis. Governments wishing to build or reform found themselves constrained not by lack of vision, but by the chains of compounding interest. When the summit called for reforming international financial institutions, it was not merely administrative. It was a plea for breathing room, an attempt to redirect resources from creditors to citizens. But achieving this would require negotiations with powerful institutions like the IMF and World Bank, entities shaped historically without Africa's prosperity in mind. The path forward would be steep. The third consequence emerged from the conversation around the Africa risk premium, a phrase that may sound technical but represents a deep structural injustice. Even countries with stable macroeconomic fundamentals, when borrowing on international markets, faced interest rates of 8.5 to 10% simply because they were African. Wealthier nations borrowed at 4% or less. For local communities, this disparity translated into delayed infrastructure, half-funded development programs, and political leaders forced to choose between long-term planning and immediate crisis management. A bridge left unrepaired could collapse. A stalled power plant could plunge a city into darkness. A canceled school project could leave another generation without opportunity. These were not abstract economic losses, they were lived political consequences. Yet not all outcomes were tied to external forces. The summit also sparked internal debates across Africa about leadership accountability and reform. If African nations sought factories, fairer loans, and stronger institutions, they would need courageous leaders willing to resist corruption, negotiate firmly, and invest in long-term development rather than short-term political gain. Citizens, too, would face a choice: remain passive observers or become active watchdogs of their government's promises. In this way, the G20's declarations became more than diplomatic statements. They became a test, a question about whether Africa could turn opportunity into genuine civil and political renewal. In living rooms across America, far from the noise of African streets or the charged hallways of the G20 summit, many older Americans watched the news with mixed emotions. Some wondered why their own country had chosen to step back at such a pivotal global gathering. Others sensed something shifting in the balance of world politics but could not yet name it. They understood, perhaps more than younger generations, that when great powers move or refuse to move, the world rarely remains the same. From the perspective of Washington, the decision to alter its level of attendance at the G20 was framed as scheduling or political necessity. But around the world, especially across the global south, it was seen as a clear message. The United States was recalibrating its engagement selectively, choosing when and how to exert influence. And that recalibration revealed a deeper truth. America's traditional grip on the global agenda has begun to loosen. Inside the summit, the vacuum created by the absence of the United States produced a surprising effect. Nations that once measured their words against American expectations suddenly spoke with clearer confidence. Their concerns were no longer softened for diplomatic comfort. They spoke of debt injustice, mineral exploitation, and the biases of international financial institutions, issues that had been building for decades but had rarely reached the center of global debate. To many American observers, this was a moment that carried echoes of earlier transitions in world history times, when new centers of influence rose while old powers recalibrated. It prompted an uncomfortable but necessary question. What is America's role in a world where the global south demands equality, not benevolence? The United States, long positioned as the architect of global financial and political order, now faced open calls for reform directed at institutions it has historically guided, such as the IMF and the World Bank. These were not whispers. They were public demands voiced at the highest global stage. Leaders asked why developing nations paid 8.5 to 10% interest while the U.S. borrowed at nearly half that rate. They questioned why credit rating agencies most headquartered in the West held the power to shape the economic fate of African nations based on models often disconnected from local realities. For Washington, this represented a strategic dilemma. If the U.S. resisted reform, it risked alienating the fastest-growing regions in the world, regions rich in minerals, young talent, and future markets. If it accepted reform, it would have to share influence with emerging powers and regional alliances confident in charting their own paths. Meanwhile, other global actors watched the summit with keen interest. Countries like China, India, Brazil, and Russia understood that Africa's desire for sovereignty and fair economic rules aligned with their own critique of Western-dominated institutions. To them, the G20 was not simply a forum, it was a battleground for shaping the future order. Yet, despite growing multipolarity, Africa maintained a remarkably independent tone. It did not pledge allegiance to any bloc. Instead, it demanded fairness from all. This stance surprised many foreign analysts, especially those accustomed to viewing Africa as a region where global powers compete for influence. The summit reminded the world that African nations are not pieces on a geopolitical chessboard, they are players in their own right. For older American viewers, the implications were profound. The world they had watched for decades, a world of clear hierarchies and predictable alliances, was changing. In its place emerged a more contested, more diverse, and perhaps more balanced global order. And at the center of this shift stood Africa, not as a recipient of decisions made elsewhere, but as a region asserting firmly and intelligently its rightful voice in shaping the future. When the last speeches faded and the delegations boarded their planes home, a strange quietness settled over the summit grounds. The bright lights dimmed, the cameras were packed away, and the polished podium stood empty. In that silence, a more honest question emerged, one that no declaration, no handshake, and no photo opportunity could answer. What happens now? For all the passion expressed at the G20 and B20, the true test will not unfold in grand halls, but in the places where ordinary life moves slowly and quietly. In the villages where a clinic waits for medicine. In the schools where children share worn-out textbooks. In the parliaments where budgets are debated line by line. In the mining towns where raw minerals still leave the soil faster than prosperity arrives. And in the hearts of millions who have learned to hope carefully because disappointment has been a familiar companion. Africa's questions remain. The Global South's burdens remain. The shadow of structural injustice still stretches long and heavy. And yet something felt different this time. For the first time in many years, there was not just rhetoric, not just polite appeals, but a clear understanding that no one will rescue Africa if Africans themselves remain silent. Power never shifts without pressure. Respect is never granted to those who hesitate to claim it. That is why the message at the end of this summit was not merely diplomatic, it was deeply personal. Africa must stand with clarity of purpose. Africa must move with one voice, not as 54 separate whispers lost in the wind. The struggles of Nigeria, of Kenya, of South Africa, of Ghana, of the Congo, they are not isolated crises. They are threads of one larger fabric woven through decades of extraction debt and imposed vulnerability. And here lies the warning. If African leaders return home with only speeches instead of action, this historic moment will dissolve into another missed opportunity. If promises of mineral processing, fairer lending, and economic sovereignty are not matched by courage and discipline, then the summit will be remembered not as a turning point, but as a symbolic pause. But there is also hope. Across the continent from Johannesburg to Ouagadougou, from Nairobi to Dakar, a new generation of leaders is rising. Leaders demanding dignity, responsibility, and sovereignty. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, whose bold stance has become a focal point in Africa news and inspired millions to believe that a different future is possible. Whether you agree with every policy or not, his presence symbolizes a shift. Africans are beginning to write their own story again. Now, the question turns to you. Do you believe Africa is finally stepping into a new era of true independence? Do you think leaders like Ibrahim Traoré can sustain this momentum, or will global pressure push the continent back into old patterns? Your voice matters here. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to recognize this historic turning point, and subscribe if you believe truth must always rise above the headlines.